Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Letter of Law. My name is Sarthak Bhardwaj, and this is the second episode of our series on how to write a legal research paper. And for the second episode, I am absolutely delighted, thrilled, overjoyed to be in conversation again with Professor Rohini Sen. Ma'am is no stranger to the viewers of Letter of Law. She has also appeared earlier on the channel, and the conversation with her is one of the most loved episodes on the show so far. So I'm very, very happy that ma'am could join me. Rohini ma'am, thank you so much for taking time out and being here with me today.
Thank you for inviting me to join you again. I'm quite looking forward to this conversation, much like the last one.
No, indeed. In fact, I love reading Rohini ma'am's work so much. And when I started this series, I just knew that I had to get ma'am on board. And after getting a legal practitioner to open the series on legal writing, I think it's the natural course to have a proper academic talk to us about how legal writing is actually done. So with that, ma'am, before we actually get down to business, how have you been lately? What have you been up to? Where are you joining us from? And so on.
I am still in London and looking forward to hopefully enjoy the London summer, which is towards a slow onset. I'm also in the middle of my PhD fieldwork, which requires me to interview people. So I'm pretty much doing what you are at the moment.
Are you enjoying that?
I am. I think you can learn as we spoke of this in the last, conversation as well. There's much to learn by listening to people, by talking to them, and in a sense, collaborating with them through their own teaching journey. So I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
Oh, definitely. Now, ma'am, given that the topic of our discussion today is how to write a legal research paper, and writing papers is thought of as a specific domain of academics, I want to talk a little about something that you've written in your Twitter bio. You've written masquerading as an academic. I wonder what you mean by that.
I was thinking about this when you were introducing me as a proper academic. I very often don't think of myself as one. I've always seen myself as an academic outlier in
Yeah.
the sense that there are certain traditional expectations from academics about how to conduct themselves, about how often to write, and so on and so forth. So, for the longest time, I've seen myself as an academic outlier, both in terms of not fulfilling some of those requirements and also in terms of how I approach academia. But with time, I have started seeing this as other ways of being in academia. So, and I think everybody is masquerading. Most of academia is very performative. We are performing when we are teaching, we are performing when we are writing. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that all of us are masquerading. Maybe some are more, comfortable in doing it. So
A slight digression, but is that performance in a good way? Uh, I mean, acting in classes or while writing, performance being performative at that sense, is it in a good way, or is that being a charlatan in some ways?
oh no, it's inherent to what we do.
I
Each
see.
of us perform in different, even in this interview, there are performative aspects in the sense that
Sure.
how we speak, how we present our public facing personalities socially. And teaching is deeply performative because you have to adapt to the energy of the classroom, you bring your own to the classroom, then your politics changes the texture. So performative in that sense.
Yeah.
And because there's so much human interface and human interaction in academia in general, I think of it as one of the most performative kinds of work that we do.
I understand. Ma'am, so when did your own journey as an academic writer begin? Were you always into writing while in law school? When did you seriously start considering writing academically? What has your entire journey been?
This is a really interesting question. You know why? And I was thinking about it since the time you approached me for the episode. Because I want to make a distinction between writing and publishing.
Mm,
Those are two different activities.
yeah.
You could be writing in different genres, in different forms, in different capacity. All of that doesn't necessarily have to translate into publication. And I think when we talk about academic writing, very often we conflate the two. So you'll find that a lot of people have been writing or experimenting with writing, but it's not necessarily translating into publication.
Mm,
And as to what constitutes writing, it could just be a draft you're displeased with, to a well written email, to a well
mhm.
constructed text. I consider these various facets of writing. So if you think of writing in that sense, then I have been writing for a long time. And
Yeah.
the idea of writing came to me, from when I was in school, but that was a very different kind of writing that I'd envisioned. And I think throughout law school, I haven't done much academic publishing. That happened subsequently in course of my LLM, but writing is something I have done all my life. The
Wow.
publishing is a more contemporary act.
No, that is true. In fact, I must confess that my first blush with your writing, ma'am, was through your Instagram posts, which was so insightful and so well written. I initially thought that you were a writer of some sort. I mean, of course you are. And then I read your profile, I read your work, which was just extremely, extremely insightful. But moving on, when I started this series, ma'am, uh, I received a very interesting question, a comment of sorts. I call this series the art of writing a legal research paper. And someone said to me, legal writing isn't really an art, because if you think of it to be that way, you won't be able to critique your work and ruthlessly edit when the situation comes to that. How do you perceive legal academic writing as a form?
Um, so I will answer this question as somebody who's trained in legal academia, but I get my, to quote a friend, I get my toolboxes from elsewhere, from other disciplines. So in that sense, I think the conventional understanding of what is legal academic writing is not how I see it. All writing can be an art if you make it. And we'll probably come to that at some point in the conversation, because I think it's very important to introduce play into your work and reorient yourself and figure out what parts of your work you enjoy and what parts you don't, especially the writing part of it. And there are ways of doing that. But I do think legal writing is and can be an art, because you don't have to conform yourself and limit yourself to any one form of writing. The editing part is always hard, yes, which is also why you have editorial processes, so that you don't have to go through the horrible heartbreak of taking out these beautiful paragraphs and sentences yourself. Um, I know of very few academics who enjoy editing, honestly. I mean, I can't think of anybody who enjoys editing, especially when a reviewed article comes back to us. The editing part is excruciating. So there are parts you dislike, but despite that, it can still be art, because you're meant to go through periods of dissatisfaction with art as well. So I would most certainly think of legal writing as art, largely because um, of how you want to approach it and how you want to introduce the idea of play into your writing.
That's
And
that's
having
a,
said that, sorry, I cut
no,
you off.
please go on, go on.
No, I was just saying, having said that, a substantive part of academic writing can be very boring, can be very inaccessible, and I can see why it creates an impression of not being fun, not being artistic, and so on and so forth.
Indeed. Wow, that's a very interesting perspective. But before I move to the next question, there's something that you said earlier that I'd like to talk about, given that most of our viewers are students. You said that you didn't write a lot in your undergrad and most of your writing was in your master's. So if someone who wishes to be an academic doesn't write a lot in their undergrad, are there chances of obtaining admissions for a foreign LLM still open and bright, or how has the situation changed? I think people would be interested to know that.
This is a good question, and I think it helps us segue into talking about some of the long-standing problems, both with academia and academic aspirations. Um, at your undergrad level, most institutions do not expect you to produce research papers of a certain maturity. I will not say quality, because quality is a very subjective thing, but of a certain maturity and perspective. So when undergraduate applications are made for higher education, if you have a publication that is well taken, but if you do not, that's not an expectation a master's program will have from you, because the understanding is that you're there to learn and to fine tune whatever that you may have learned in undergrad, because undergrad law school learning is very dispersed.
Sure.
Having said that, this operates within this broad context of a mad windfall to publish. And this is not just for students, it's also for my academic colleagues. There are institutional demands to publish, and people are trying to fulfill that. And very often we are not looking at the outcome or the consequences, one of which is, if everybody is publishing so much, who's reading and who has the time to read? I mean, I can't keep up with most of the stuff that people are writing. And as a student, when your ideas are still forming, when you have other obligations, when you have to worry about internships and all, this is indeed challenging to think that if you didn't write something of worth, you'll not be given admission into an institution. So to students who have this aspiration, I'd like to say that if you're not writing, again, if you're not publishing during your undergraduate time, it is okay if you're still writing, because that's certainly doing something to your long-term writing skills.
Mm.
Um, and because the nature of application and writing has changed over a period of time, by which I mean you will see more blogs and short
Mm.
forms, I would actually encourage students to find a good blog to contribute to, one
Wow.
that has a good editing process, because it allows you to put something out there which is both workable in terms of your resume and also is an experience in itself, allows you to go through the publication process and make mistakes and learn from it, and also see your writing in print, because I think that does something. So if a full-fledged academic publication is not possible during your undergraduate time, which is very likely for a host of reasons, try blogs, try substantively edited blogs, peer-reviewed blogs, critical blogs. That's definitely a good way to start your academic writing journey.
Wow, that's great, because when I've been talking to people, the advice that they give on the podcast is that writing blogs may not be at par with writing papers. So if you write papers, that'll obviously hold you in better stead. But I understand what you're trying to say, that writing papers is a daunting task for an undergrad, and blogs are about 100, 1,000, 1,200 words, which is quite doable. Am I right in understanding that?
Somewhat. Also, it's a considerable time commitment. You can write an academic paper in your undergraduate periods if you'd
Yeah.
like to. My understanding is it will be a substantive time commitment. And having seen the way Indian legal education operates, I think very often an undergraduate paper is either a conference presentation that translates into a paper, or a project or a undergrad thesis that translates into a paper, predominantly because one is in a hurry to publish.
Yeah.
And these are very valid concerns. Now, with something like that, there are a couple of unintended outcomes. One of which is, you become an accidental expert in a subject because you publish one paper, then you present it, recycle it, and present it somewhere. And very soon you find yourself presenting a lot of abstracts on a subject you just picked up out of the blue and you're not really very interested in. This is a less serious consequence of doing something like this. The slightly more relevant one, I would say, is while it gives you the practice of how to write an academic paper in all its complexities, the length and the duration and all of that, I am not sure that's the best way to introduce yourself to academic writing, especially if you're feeling pressure to do so.
Mm.
And of course, blogs are not comparable to academic articles. They're not meant to be, but they are a good way to inculcate ideas, to practice your writing skills. And I must tell you, it's hard to write blogs because 1,000, 2,000 words, while it's not comparable to 8,000 word academic article, requires you to think with a certain degree of precision. And that's very, very good academic practice. So I'd absolutely not discourage people from writing blogs.
Yeah.
Those could be, simultaneous aspirations you have, but the pressure to write an academic article during your undergraduate study is a needless pressure. So even if things are competitive, take your time with it. There'd always be something to do.
Ma'am, can you recommend some peer-reviewed blogs that you think are good enough and have a decent reputation that students may consider publishing in?
I could share a list with you, maybe perhaps at
Yeah.
the end of this, and then you could maybe link it to the.
I'll put it in the
it'll
description box.
Yeah.
That'd be great. And ma'am, this discussion brings me to another slight digression before we get into the substantive points. Because students are writing to enhance their CVs, sometimes academics are writing because of professional commitments. That leads me to wonder what really is the aim behind writing and publishing a paper. Is it to influence policy making? Is it to just generate better debate? Is it to help courts better interpret the law? What is the purpose for writing and publishing a paper?
This question will have so many different answers. Different people write for different reasons.
Sure.
And I think all of those are true. And the kind of writing that people are doing will give you an indication of what the intended outcome is. There are the kinds of writing that make their way to the court because it's geared towards a certain kind of doctrinal analysis, doctrinal engagement, or perhaps even tracking the court's interaction with theory and practice. So there's obviously that, and I think the court takes cognizance of that. But We've also seen that the court uh, refers to a vast repertoire of different kinds of writing.
Yeah.
It could also be to influence policymakers and generate debates. Again, you have a specific outcome and intended audience in mind and you cater to it. It could simply be for intellectual pursuit. It's an idea that interests you, engages you, and you want to write more about it. In some instances, as has been the case for me, I think it could be something in course of your teaching that generates curiosity. So most, if not all, my writings have come from certain kinds of classroom experiences. So it could also be to go back to the classroom with a different understanding of something that you started with. I think all of these are reasons to write, but there's a bigger question here in terms of what you're asking, which is what is a substantive academic impact, and what sort of impact do academic output generate? And I think it would be, I don't have the answer to that question, but it would be good to map that. Academics have a certain idea in their head about what they think their writings are doing. My sense is that doesn't map on to the actual academic impact, because the way academic writing is dispersed is very diffused. So it would be interesting to see what sort of writings make to the court, what sort of writings find their way into policy, other than policy briefs and draft reports, and what sort of writings have long-term impact beyond curricular teaching. I don't think this mapping exercise has been done. I don't even know how to do it, but it would be nice to see the the relationship between why academics write and what is the intended impact actually.
Ma'am, coming back to something that you said earlier, do you think Indian courts deal adequately with academic scholarship? And if they don't, do you think they should?
I don't think they deal adequately with academic scholarships, and there's certainly much scope and room to do that. There have been a few instances where they have been more willing to engage with academic scholarship, but there is room to do much more. And this is important because academic scholarship allows you to question certain fundamental assumptions that people make about law, that people make about legal implications and so on and so forth, and these are necessary. Yeah. The court speaks its own language, works within certain understandings of institutions and structures, and academic scholarship can certainly help help refine some of those assumptions.
Indeed. And now, having covered all of these preliminary questions, which I was really interested to talk to you about, I think we can finally deep dive into some of the more substantive points. And like you said, most of your writing and publishing has come from your teaching experiences. Ideas have generated there. So how do you suggest that people go about selecting a topic that could be both relevant, contemporary, is of value, and can be written about? How do you go about choosing topics, and how do you suggest others do so as well?
This is a very personal question, I mean, again, it depends on what are your motivations to write and what sort of audience are you writing for. So there are two different kinds of writing I do. There's writing with a particular audience in mind, and in that instance, the subject of my writing will correspond to whatever is the most contemporary conversation, or not even a contemporary conversation, but then I'm speaking to a set of people. And then there's writing I do entirely for myself. It will have a set of readers, but in these writings, I'm more interested in laying out how I'm thinking about a particular topic, obviously in engagement with the work of others and with a variety of factors, but these kinds of writings are different. So in the former, I'd be more mindful of what are the contemporary conversations, what are the meaningful conversations in that area for the time being. The latter, that's not what I would be thinking. So choosing a topic, as you say, is difficult. I would say I respond to a topic. So if something catches my interest, and if it excites me, then I want to think more about it, read more about it, and at some point, either continue to go ahead with the idea of writing something or abandon it. Because in academic writing, it's important to know what to finish writing, what not to finish writing, what to read, what not to read. These sort of decisions are important, and you kind of figure it out along the way. There is one thing I generally advise students to not do in the beginning of their academic writing career, which is jump onto this whole bandwagon of hot takes. I know it works well for some people eventually, and it's good that people are able to synthesize information with that speed and then put out something as and when things are happening. But at the beginning of your academic writing career, hot takes are things I would ask people to maybe reconsider, because it's necessary to acquire a certain kind of thinking capacity. And very often, hot takes, especially when you're young and you're still learning, may not be the most useful way to learn about writing. But then, each to their own. Some people are really, really good at that. So, just in terms of what not to do, that's one of the things that comes to mind.
Right.
Um, Again, in terms of selecting something, I think if people are interested in keeping up with contemporary events, then that's one way to go. You see what interests you in the realm of whatever is happening currently, and then think about it and decide if you want to go ahead and write. You could also go back to looking at something that has been done in a new and different way. So topic selection, I understand it seems very, very daunting, but
Yeah.
my simple advice would be go with what resonates with you. Even if it has been done to death, there is no harm in looking it up again, reading about it, trying something new. Again, you may not end up publishing, but if you want to write, do it. There's no reason not to.
This is actually a very interesting point, and I'll segue into the other question, which is this whole thing of contributing something new to the scholarship. I've often been told that unless and until you cannot add something new to the discourse, you perhaps shouldn't try publishing or writing in it. But like you said, even if a topic has been explored to death, it is still worthwhile to see if you can add something to it. What's your take on this adding new to the discourse debate?
The word new can be understood in many ways. First of all, I find it troubling that there's so much pressure to come up with something new, something original all the time. It's ridiculous, frankly, because new and original, or ideas of newness and originality, have been constructed with a very specific idea of academia in mind. It's a certain kind of imagination of academia that expects you to be constantly producing and then constantly producing new. Neither of those things are feasible, or even things one should encourage. So, new could simply be revisiting something old. New could also be acknowledging that you have nothing new to say. I think that's probably a trend that should pick up in academia, where people just decide, okay, I have nothing else to say right now. Maybe I should take a break from writing. New could also be, a way of querying, whereas you're rereading an old thing using new heuristics. And
Yeah.
this is the part where I think something that I was telling you earlier about me being trained in law, but borrowing my heuristics from different disciplines comes in handy.
Yeah.
Because when I go back to an old law text, I read it differently now. These are also ways of doing new. And I think this kind of new encourages interdisciplinarity, encourages you to look at the same thing from different perspectives. It's training a very specific thinking muscle, and that's helpful than dispersively looking at 20 different things and then not knowing how to string them together and then getting stressed, because that happens to students very often.
Yeah.
So I'm a slow academic, and I encourage others to embody some of that slowness, because then you can both savor the reading and writing that you're doing without having to worry about an original output, a new output, which is, I mean, it's not just for students, it's impossible even for late career academics and senior scholars to constantly keep coming up with something new. And if you read, the body of work in any particular scholar, you will see it's fine tuning and refining some of their earlier ideas, or even abandoning them. Good scholarship, I mean, rather than this need to produce something new constantly. Having said that, if somebody has the urge to fully abandon law and take up another discipline, that could also be new, and then maybe come back to law, not come back to law. So I think what I'm trying to say is there are different ways of thinking about new, and it may not resonate with everybody, but I certainly think this sustains more curiosity about learning, about writing, and so on and so forth, including things that have been done to death.
I understand. To the viewers, I'd like to tell ma'am called herself a slow academic, but I still think that, I think ma'am's being humble because, but I think it's a good thing, because whenever I've read Rohini ma'am's writing, it's patient, it's well thought out. Every argument is laid out precisely and it draws you in. I very rarely finish academic papers from start to end, but ma'am's writing is something that I've always enjoyed, and I link some of her work that I found insightful, and be sure to check that out. Uh, Moving
Very
on,
kind of you to say that. Thank you.
you're welcome, ma'am. Moving on, once you have decided a topic, ma'am, and you've sort of done the research and everything, how do you proceed to write? I mean, are you writing simultaneously while researching? Are you compiling stuff at a place to read later? What's your entire process after you've thought of a topic, researched a
Hmm.
bit, and now you're actually getting down to business of writing?
I think there are 2, 3 different ways of doing this. I, depending on my comfort level with the subject, if I think it's something I have worked with in the past, I would first write, I wouldn't say write a draft, but I'd go into this sort of free flowing writing process just to see what I already know.
Hmm.
So for some kinds of writing, I first write out without any reading. This gives me a good sense of what needs to be done further, what's already there, and also an activity where I map my own understanding, current understanding of the subject. So that's one kind of writing, and that I do gauging my own sense of comfort with the specific area. In some instances, I spend a substantive amount of time reading, and then I make note of things of interest. And this is still not, I don't have a structure yet, but I
Yeah.
make note of things of interest, which invariably, I mean, you have a structure in mind, even if it is not concrete. And very often you will find yourself reading and noting stuff that leads towards the subconscious understanding of a structure. That's another way to write sometimes. Um, there are other kinds of writings where I just can't proceed until I have a very clear outline, or at least in terms of a basic structure. So, and that actually takes me a lot longer than the writing or the reading. So I could be spending weeks simply writing 5 lines of a structure, but I devote all those weeks to writing those 5 lines, following which the writing process itself may take 3 to 4 days at most. So different kinds of writing depending on your comfort level, how how you've mapped your own writing journey, and so on and so forth. And uh, I'd say experiment with writing forms.
Hmm.
Write out a draft and see where you are with that, or maybe finish reading and then jot down points, or do your structure so clearly that that sort of sets the course for everything you will write. You don't have to stick to any one way of writing, and each of us will have more than one ways of writing. To that end, something I strongly recommend for people who seriously want to do writing is keeping a writing journal, uh, like an affective journal of sorts. Not simply about the methods and the modes that you use about writing, but how you feel about your writing.
Hmm.
There are these series of interesting, reflections by writers, academic and non-academic, on the affective process of their writing. And people, I came across something very interesting where somebody is saying, I find myself clutching my head in my hand and trying to pull my hair out. So anybody watching me would think I'm going through great distress, but I'm simply writing. So it's interesting to have an affective journal. People have so many kinds of quirks. Some people don't wash their hair till they're done writing. People will sit in a particular position. So it's useful to observe your own affective journey, the kind of writing that excited you, the kind of writing that depressed you, the kind of writing that was hard. What hour of the day do you find yourself most conducive to write? Now, for some people, this could be a particular hour consistently, in which case, once you've identified it, try and get your writing done during that time. If that is not the case, be more in tune with your body in terms of when you have the most amount of creative energy, and then try and write then. So I strongly recommend keeping an affective writing journal that talks about your writing journey and your feelings about writing in addition to the writing that you do. I think it
what
comes in handy.
What are your feelings about your writing?
I have 2 affective journals,
Oh wow.
one in which I jot down ideas and how I feel about them.
Hmm.
The other is documenting my writing journey. So I can be anything from a very, very organized, methodical writer to a spontaneous writer. And some of my writing that looks effortless actually requires a lot of work, whereas the writing that looks like it's taken a work, sometimes it's fairly effortless. But I am not, I have 3 to 4 different versions of writing. I document my methods. I do not have a consistent hour of the day where I'm most productive. I have to find that energy at any given point of the day and decide. There are days when I just don't have any energy to write, but I will still write. I'm not very inspired by those writings. Many a times I come back to a piece of writing and I feel differently about it.
Hmm.
So, there are these different things I've noted about myself in terms of, and it's, for me, I think writing is a very personal, a very exciting, and also a very painful process. And I mean painful in a good way, because it takes a lot out of you when you write. So if I have written something substantive and I'm drained, I wouldn't want to write again for the next couple of days. So
This
yeah.
brings me to another question on the perils of writing, and I talked about it in the previous episode as well. Nassim Taleb, in one of his books, said that singers enjoy singing, painters enjoy painting, but writers enjoy having written and not the actual act of writing. What is your take on this? Do you enjoy the process of writing, or do you also enjoy having written?
I have to say I enjoy both.
Hmm.
And this is a question I've been asked very often, and I recognize that there is a difference between people who enjoy, as you said, the having written part and the other experiences associated with writing, but not the actual writing itself. But I do enjoy writing. So any insight I offer on writing comes from the perspective of somebody who really enjoys it. It is a very enjoyable, playful process for me. It can also be horrid and stressful, especially when I have a deadline and when I'm sick of reading my own lines on the screen and it no longer makes sense. Those are there. But the core impulse for me, I think, is to enjoy. And I also try to make, as I was telling you, make play around writing. So sometimes if I'm in the middle of writing on a legal subject, I take a break from it and I go and read something completely different. It may or may not be useful for my writing, but that's something I do. I try to find different spaces to go and write at. Particularly enjoy going to, different libraries, different cafes, or even different parts of my house, because I
Wow.
think that helps in terms of how I want to reframe my writing. So I try and find other ways of looking at the writing, particularly when I think I'm stuck. And there's a way to be stuck as well. You can enjoy being stuck, you can enjoy the distress of being stuck, and so on and so forth. So I think reframing your stage of writing can take away some of the pain of ideating, of also going through the very, very mundane part of writing. Writing can be very mundane. When
Hmm.
you're thinking, it's exciting. When you're writing it out, it may not always be. When you're editing, it may not always be. So I think there are things each of us can do to kind of both have a sustainable routine for the mundane part and also make it exciting in small ways.
I absolutely love the romantic approach you have towards writing. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, maybe this part I can put out as an individual video. This will go on. This will be a nice short video. but I'm coming to the next question. I think a very important part of preparing a paper is structuring it, especially because when it goes for the editorial process, one of the first things that are looked at is perhaps the abstract, introduction, conclusion, and not so much the main body, at least in the first blush of the things.
Hmm.
Um, so how should a person go about structuring a paper? I understand it's a vague question because each
Hmm.
paper has different demands and requirements, but still some broad outlines as to how structuring of a paper can be done.
This is actually a good question, and I'll tell you why. Um, it partly depends on what your intended publication is, and partly on the journal you have in mind. So in this instance, I would suggest, if somebody, let's say, has a particular journal in mind, every journal has their own publication ethos. You will see their brand if you spend some time looking at the kind of articles they publish and the kind of formats they generally include. There are journals that experiment with format, and there are those that do not. So the first step is to identify what sort of journal you have in mind, and then spend some time looking at what kind of writing they seem to be publishing. And now I'm talking about publication, not writing per
Yeah,
se,
yeah.
or rather, a combination of the two. Once you've done that, if the journal has a very clear structure of preference, then that's fairly easy. You simply write it out the way they would like you to. If it doesn't, I would encourage everybody to play, especially people who want to write, to play a little with form, to find, your writing sweet spot, to see if you can do more than one form of writing, because I think it's possible for different writing styles to speak to each other. Now, the conventional academic writing, especially in legal academia, is to set out an introduction,
Hmm.
telling people what is it that you want to do with
Yeah.
the rest of the article, then you come to the body, and then you come to the conclusion. And this is a tried and tested method of writing because it provides a certain kind of clarity. I have nothing against it.
Hmm.
A good way to do this kind of writing would be very clearly state what is it that you want to do in your abstract, because we often encounter, sometimes when we're submitting abstracts for a paper, when you don't even have the full paper in mind, the abstract tends to be very vague. It also intends to say a lot of things that may not make sense.
Yeah.
But some people have the skill of making that sound coherent, others may not. So there will be a departure between the abstract you write at the beginning and the paper you eventually submit, especially if you've not thought through about what is going into the abstract. But if you have a clearer sense of what is it that you want to do with the paper long term, the abstract can be slightly more concise and refined. Following which, setting out the introduction, and this is where the third kind of writing that I was telling you about that I do, which is have a clear structure, comes in very handy. Because if you break down your writing into small bullet points, it is then easy to write an introduction in terms of what is it that you want to do with the rest of the paper. Sometimes this works. Sometimes you will finish the paper and come back to the introduction. A lot of academics do that because what you've written is different from how you imagined it. And then the introduction, even though it is the introduction, serves the purpose of tying your article together and actually ends up being the concluding feature of your writing.
Yeah.
So it's helpful to do that afterwards. Typically, these paper structures also tell you shouldn't write anything new in the conclusion. Conclusion should be rounding up everything that you've written in the beginning. I don't think I'm 100% on board with that. I don't see why your conclusion can't leave room for something new to emerge from there. Not in a way where you're throwing off the reader saying, oh, now I also thought of this, but in a way where you're sort of both rounding up and saying there are these strands of thinking that have also emerged. I can hopefully pursue this at some point and maybe others can take up from my work, but it's not necessary that the conclusion should always be this, okay, I'm wrapping up what I have to say. That's not the only way to write a conclusion. So that would be one way to structure and think about academic writing. The other thing, I remember we had spoken of this in our last conversation as well. I think reading has to be a difficult task sometimes.
Yeah.
You have to use, your existing thinking tools. And I don't mean this in the inaccessible academic jargony kind of way. I mean this in a way where, oh, this piece is making me think I want to come back to it. So if reading has to be that way, there can be writing that corresponds to that sort of reading as well. By which I mean introduction, conclusion, and body is a very Western liberal academic mode of writing. There are other forms of writing that you can encounter. I remember speaking of this to somewhere else, and I came across this analytic of different forms of Japanese writing, talking about screenplay, talking about even academic work as well. And the term they use, which I find absolutely fascinating, is they said writing can sometimes be like a tempura batter. You have to eat through the batter to get to the good part.
Wow.
So there are other forms of writing I think people can think about, people can experiment with, and also bring into the broader academic discourse. It doesn't always have to be in a specific structure. You can do good writing without introduction, body, conclusion. You can do good writing by setting context and then taking your reader on a journey. And I'm talking about academic writing as well. You're taking your reader on an interesting journey of different themes, then tying the themes together. You can do good writing by offering your reader certain tools instead of an introduction and saying, focus on this while you're reading, don't focus on this while you're reading, and see how the text speaks to you. I think these are very much possible, not just within the realm of academic writing, but in the realm of legal academic writing.
Yeah.
As I said, I'm a slow academic, I write sparsely, but I have tried to do some of this in my work, heavily inspired by the work of others. So definitely possibilities.
No, I absolutely love the sort of unconventional approach that you're suggesting towards writing. And I feel because a lot of writers, especially we as students, want to experiment with that. But because we are constantly told that, no, you want to publish, you do these things, the editor will like your work and you'll get published. So, but hearing an academic, although you don't call yourself a proper academic, but hearing an academic tell someone that, it is a possibility to explore this method, I think it's great encouragement. Coming up to the next question, ma'am, do you think that people who are writing with an aim to publish, and not just writing for intellectual pleasure, should they select a journal beforehand, or should they just go ahead with the topic they have and then decide where they can fit that paper into a journal?
This is again a good question, and one I don't know if I'm best placed to answer, because I think a lot of people strategically chart out their academic career in a way where they identify journals of prominence, journals of certain critical valence, and then publish. I've not done that. But having been in academia, having been parts of editorial boards and review processes, I can tell you that I, if an idea interests you, sit with the idea and then chalk out 2 3 journals that might be interested in this kind of work, for which you'll have to look at the journal profile, not limit yourself to one but 2 or 3. And that way you are both, spending time with an idea that's of interest to you, and also in some ways letting it correspond to the journal profile, and those two things can happen simultaneously.
Yeah.
And which is not to say you can't do one or the other. You could pick up an interesting journal issue, read what they have to say, and then think, okay, this looks like an interesting journal, I might want to publish here. And even those processes help you think about ideas. I usually find that, at a stage, at your undergraduate stage, there are multiple things that interest you. And it's, we think it's easier to write about things that interest us, but that may not always be true. Yeah. Sometimes it's very difficult to write about something that is of interest to you, either because, you don't want that nature of interest to change, or where you go down that path, you find that it's no longer as interesting. But I think these are some of the journeys that one has to make in course of academic writing. And I understand all of this demands a lot of time, something that students seem to have less and less in this time and day. So part of my, suggestions come from an impulse to ask people to slow down and to structurally slow down academia in a way that is helpful, especially if you want to enjoy and sustain it. There are always ways of getting a few quick fix publications out, having it on your CV, and then going on to have an academic career. Those things happen. But all of this is coming from a place of, if you want to enjoy it, slow down, savor it, pick and choose what you want to do. And I fully understand sometimes you may not have the option to pick and choose, but the one thing you can choose is to enjoy the work that you do despite the circumstances. And this is easier said than done, especially given the stage of my career I'm at, and I'm not living the very complicated student lives that some of you are. It's very different for all of you. Despite that, I would say, especially because new forms of writing have emerged, there are more and more online portals to write, do that. And the other thing that I strongly encourage, not just for students, for everybody, for colleagues as well, co-author, collaborate. Write with more than one author if necessary. This is not an individual process. It can be, but even when you're writing on your own, you will usually find the writing is sharpened by conversation with colleagues, by friends. There are numerous supporting structures, some of which we consider in the realm of intellectual, which is books, colleagues, and so on and so forth, some of which we don't, which is the kind of domestic support system that helps us pursue these. I'm actually of the opinion that these support systems are equally intellectual. We just don't think of them that way. But collaborate and co-author. Co-authoring experiences can also be very, very difficult sometimes. But if there is a way to form a good, solid, nurturing community, I would strongly encourage doing this, because it takes the stress of producing something on your own. It also takes away the illusion that you're constantly working on your own. You really aren't. And at that stage of your career, you will, if you're thinking of it in terms of career, you will benefit a lot from collaborating with others. So seriously think about collaborating and co-authoring.
I completely agree with that. In fact, in my second and third year, I used to think I'll only write about constitutional law, because that was a time I was reading Professor Aparna Chandra's work, Gautam Bhatia's work, and so on. But then now that I've started interning a bit more and I've thrown into the deep end of procedure, I've found that writing on the civil procedure code can be an extremely interesting activity, even though the subject is thought of to be boring. But that's not true, because there are so many unsettled questions within the procedural code, CPC, that can be explored. And I got to that point only because a co-intern and I had discussions about it, and we eventually wrote a paper which I hope gets published, but let's see.
I'm
Now,
looking forward to reading that paper. That sounds very interesting.
yeah, I hope it does get accepted, and you'll be the first person that I send it across to, ma'am, if it does. Uh, Ma'am, coming to the point of where to get published, now there are a lot of journals, and I'm talking about a paper. Of course, blogs are a different thing. When it comes to papers, there are a lot of Indian journals. Some of them are student led. Now, then there are international journals, which of course have more reputation, only because I think because they're associated to a university that has been in existence for a large period of time. Do you think that getting your work published in an Indian journal that's run by students, there are, I mean, all national law universities, other law schools have their own student led journals. Is it still okay to get published there, or is it not going to be valuable in the conventional sense of the word? Of course, I mean, every publication is valuable in its own way.
Um, Very recently, some of my friends and I wrote this piece on academic publication. It's a short blog piece. It's up on Opinio Juris. We wrote this in response to an academic's call to publish in Global South journals. This was within the context of international law, but he'd written out a paper saying the Global South academia, intellectual space, and publication space needs a boost. It would be nice if Global North academics published there. In response to that, my friends and I, friends who are also colleagues and just people I've been collaborating with for a long time, we charted out how publication is perceived broadly in the Global North and Global South. What are some of the challenges and what are some of the deficits? So it would be an interesting set of reflections for people to read, I think, in terms of publication strategizing. And the reason I said this is because it sets context for what I'm about to say next. Why do you want to publish? Do you want to publish for impact? Do you want to publish for visibility? Do you want to publish because you think you want to make some kind of meaningful intervention, both in academia and in the highly unequal academic and publication structure that we have? That will influence your decision to identify a place to publish. Personally, for me, I would very much publish in a student-run journal. My experience with Indian law school student-run journal has been very, very good. The editorial quality is wonderful. The teams are very generative. And because these are peer-reviewed, I don't see any difference between a good quality peer review in Indian student-led journal versus elsewhere. My experience with peer-reviewed journal elsewhere has also been the same. So for me personally, I don't see a substantive amount of difference in terms of the writing experience and the editorial process itself. For people who are looking for a certain kind of visibility, strategizing and publishing in journals of repute then might make more sense. But I would say don't rule out the experience of publishing in a student-led journal. It's a generative and learning experience both for the editorial team and yourself. And I am always surprised with the amount of work that students put in, the level at which they're thinking. This is always, a very, very nice surprise to me. A lot of us were not thinking like this when we were law school students. Things have changed a lot. There's a different level of awareness to doing academic work. So I would certainly encourage that. And also then publish strategically in a journal that gets you visibility, because wanting to be read and being seen as a scholar is a necessary part of academic writing. Everybody wants that. So it would be futile to say, no, that is not an aspiration. Sure. But balance them out. I don't think anybody is losing out on quality publication or quality experience by engaging with student-led journals in India.
Right. Ma'am, I'm sure you must have also served as an editor in various capacities for different journals and platforms. What are some things that immediately make you like or dislike a paper?
I think it's, having done this for a while, you kind of identify what stage the writer may be at. Of course, these are blind reviews, so there's no way to ascertain. But I think it's important to understand where the writer is coming from, both in terms of their training, in terms of their intellectual journey, and so on and so forth. So some of the things now, or rather, we stop doing in course of the editorial process is nitpicking things like language and things like structure and all of that. Yeah. Some kind of clarity of thought is important, not necessarily a wide-ranging clarity of thought on the issue, but rather a clarity of thought about this is how I want to say what I want to say. And you're not expected to know everything. You're expected to show a degree of rigor in your research, which one can tell. So by which I mean, if the entire article is based on two other articles, that may
Mm.
not fly very well.
Yeah.
Having said that, you don't have to refer to 40 different sources either. These are writing hacks. People will use footnotes they may not have read in entirety. Everybody knows this, nobody talks about it. So but some degree of diversity in the writing is interesting, and that is why you have the editorial process, to not just tell you that, oh, this is also interesting, you can look at that, but also kind of streamline your writing and say maybe you could also consider these questions. um, I've digressed somehow to say that there are good ways of reviewing and there are harsh and bad ways of reviewing. And let me see if I can try and respond to your question and talk about good reviewing at the same time. I'd say clarity of thought, demonstrating some degree of rigor in terms of how much time one has spent with the research, different sources, and so on and so forth. Um, Recognizing what one doesn't know. One of the things we encounter a lot is, I think confident writing is good, but it's useful to know that it's a very small part of what you know and what is out there. And then when certain kinds of writing try to push through an idea, so this is the only thing one has ever said on the subject, that may not be warming up the reviewer very much.
Mm.
It's a slightly arrogant way of looking at knowledge making, and that's usually not something that editorial boards or reviewers will pick as a sign of good writing. um, so not acknowledging what you don't know, what are the limitations, is helpful. And just some diversity of rigor. um, this is other thing I want to talk about in the context of this. Again, this is digressing somewhat, but I think it's important. I've noticed a lot of what I call the first text syndrome in people's writing. This happens with all of us. It happened with me too. So, you read something that you really, really like, or it changes the way you think, and that sticks with you.
Mm.
And I call it the first text syndrome because that's probably the first text that sticks with you. And it's very hard to make that unstick. So a
Mm.
lot of your writing for a long time will reflect that framework, that ethos. And that's a good thing because it tells you what inspired you. And at some point, you will also know when to let go of that inspiration or add something onto it.
Yeah.
But in writing, it usually translates into either a piece of article being written based on just that idea without questioning it, without challenging it, or using that as, something important, something more significant than it really is. By which I mean, I have encountered something for the first time doesn't mean the thing has come into existence for the first time.
Right.
And very often I see a slippage from the first to the second. So there is the, oh, this is very interesting, I just came across this, here are my reflections, versus this has never been done before and here I am trying to do this. And I think it would be useful to be a little mindful of when that is happening.
Yeah.
So as a reviewer, as an editor, I think these are the things I look for: clarity of thought to the extent possible, some demonstrable rigor in terms of how you formed your arguments and what sort of sources you've used. I'm not picky about language. I think that's something that can be worked on.
Yeah.
That's really not an indicator of anything. And also just, knowing what you don't know and maybe consciously avoiding this first text syndrome type situation. So yeah.
Right. That's a great take. Another question I have, in fact, it emerges from a tweet that I read, and lately I found that Twitter has become a great platform to learn about academia and writing and all of these
Yeah,
things. But someone said that you must seriously start publishing when you can start speaking with your own voice, when you don't feel the need to footnote each of your assertion, when you can be more confident in what you're trying to say. What's your understanding or perception of this?
See, I have a slightly different understanding on what constitutes your own voice and originality, which is
Mm.
not to take away anything from what I think this tweet is trying to convey in essence. But my understanding is ideas don't belong to people. You
Mm.
cannot intellectualize claims and personalize them. In contemporary academic format, we do that. We write saying, this is what I have written. But my sense and my understanding is these are not original. They don't belong to us. They are at any given point coming to us from different places and different sources. Some we are in the capacity to acknowledge, others we are not because we don't even fully comprehend it. And obviously, the academic format limits us. So because I view writing like that, I have a standard acknowledgement that says these don't belong to us, they come from different sources. So following that, what you do or don't do with footnotes is sort of, set into context by this. Having
Yeah.
said that, there are certain useful things to take from that tweet. One of which is, this is something another colleague of mine whose work I greatly admire had said, that at some point in your career, you will start talking to your contemporaries rather than to the dead voices. I think that marks an important turning point in your academic journey, in your intellectual journey, in your writing journey. And footnotes are very political. Who you cite, who you don't cite, what sort of people are considered experts, this is a very, very political process.
Yeah.
And if you kind of bring this in conversation with what I said earlier, which is none of these things are intellectualized or owned by anybody, it makes for a very interesting um, perspective on footnotes. You could choose not to footnote because you believe in the former, barring the minimum requirement of, whatever falls within the convention of not intellectual theft. You could also make a political statement with your footnotes, which is, if a white male scholar were to write without citations, that would be considered as legitimate, as authoritative, as creative. But if an early career scholar, as far away from white and male as possible, were to do the same, that would be seen as intellectual audacity, as dishonest, and so on and so forth. Which is not to say they are always comparable in terms of their intellectual journey, and they might just be in very, very different positions of ideating, but it is a political act to not choose to footnote a certain way.
Yeah.
And certain kinds of people from certain kinds of jurisdiction are subjected to more scrutiny in terms of their footnote and in terms of their knowledge making than others. So it's useful to remember this also. But
Ma'am, yeah. Oh, sorry. Please go
no,
on.
I was just saying you can also honestly play around with footnotes. Your footnote doesn't have to be somebody else's article. It could be a piece of artwork you saw. It could be a conversation you had, provided you've taken permission from the person. It could be n number of things. So, we keep coming back to that break form, play with the form. It both tells you a lot about why academia is structured the way it does. And while there is a lot of merit in conservative ideas of rigor and structure, it's not the only way to do work. So, yeah.
Right. And to anyone watching who's thinking of writing a critical piece in academia, feel free to cite this video. I wouldn't mind at all. But ma'am, coming back to something that you said about the racism sort of aspect of it, I wouldn't call it racism so much as privilege that the color of a skin might bring. And I talked a little about this, I think, in one of our previous episode also, with a different guest. What has your experience as an Indian woman, person of color, in international law that is predominantly thought to be a European sort of subject? Have there ever been experiences where you've thought that your scholarship or contributions haven't been taken seriously because of where you come from or who you are? Because I'm seeing this discourse lately on Twitter run by senior academics from various universities. They're calling it race me too, where they've said they face similar sort of discrimination. Has that ever happened with you?
Yes, absolutely. I work in an area that sort of intersects critical legal studies intersecting with critical approaches to international law, within which I do more of 12 feminism, post-colonial feminism. There, we're still trying to find space to do this work. Also, again, when I mention this, these are not lifelong theoretical commitments. There are approaches and ethos, but very often, aside from the usual, defenses of, oh, international law is not really law, there are other sorts of defenses that we have to mount in terms of legitimacy, in terms of ways of doing law, whether this is law at all. These are questions that one answers. It has been challenging on account of who I am or the embodied identity multiple times. Your work is not taken seriously in certain places. Certain kinds of characteristics are attributed to you or your work even before your work is actually engaged with. Journals have rejected this, saying this is not a law paper.
Wow.
So I've received that sort of feedback. I actually want to tell you about a very early academic workshop experience I had, which probably motivated me to do critical approaches and TWAIL in the way that I do right now. It was a heartbreaking experience. It was a forum of international law where I had submitted a paper. This was early days and I was new to critical scholarship, and the work had much to be desired, but that was the whole point of a workshop. Your work is, early scholarship, it requires feedback and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. Now, there were 2, 3 other early career scholars there as well. Me and somebody else, I think we were the youngest both in terms of our age and in terms of the evolution of our scholarship. I saw a substantive difference between the way my paper was responded to versus the paper of somebody who was European. Both of those were harsh feedbacks. But I remember receiving a comment that said, Europe has said everything it has to about this subject. I don't understand why you've written this paper.
Oh my
And it was a
God.
terrifying experience for me. I was very young. I was starting out my academic career, and that affected me in a way so severe that I couldn't write anything for the next 2, 3 years. And anything I wrote, I felt like my work was not good enough. There's no point writing this, because that statement stayed with me, and stayed with me in a very deep, long-standing way. So not only did I stop writing, I also thought nothing I was writing was of worth, was of value, until I gained a certain amount of confidence from my teaching. Because I used to think I could write. Maybe the thinking requires certain, time and effort, but that was a very disappointing experience to have. And it's something I actually want to say to students and early career scholars. You may encounter things like this. You may have experiences with terrible, heartbreaking feedback. It's not an indication of your worth, and they can be very, very debilitating. I've spoken to other female scholars of color who've had such experiences and have been very troubled by it. I do think things are better now. People have better support structures in terms of who to reach out to, who to talk to. I didn't, so it affected me in ways that took a while to come out of. But since then, it also made me think of academia as a deeply political space, international law as a deeply political space. And I spent time reflecting on my teaching, using that to strengthen my writing, to work on it, and so on and so forth. All this to say that these things happen. These things can take a huge toll on you. At
Yeah.
some point, you may or may not develop a thicker skin, but it's best to be aware that these things happen and that there are support structures and networks to reach out to. This is what I was telling you when I said affective life of writing.
Hmm.
It's very important to understand and document how you feel about your own writing. A lot of it could be the internal journey, but there are extraneous factors that can heavily affect your writing. So it matters to understand these things.
This is a very unfortunate experience. But ma'am, nowadays I am seeing, I might be wrong in understanding, but from my experience, a lot of South Asian scholars in the field of law are at important academic positions all over the world. Do you feel that there's a change happening, or is it, or the people who reach these positions because they want to maintain their position, which is a valid concern, choose to
Hmm.
not resist these structural barriers that are already there?
This is a very, very important question, actually. It forms an integral part of the work that I do both by myself and in collaboration with a lot of my colleagues. One part of it emerges in conversation as, decolonizing the curriculum. That is something we hear of more recently, and so on and so forth. Uh, I think a lot of scholars who inhabit these spaces, there's certainly merit in being present in these spaces in a certain way. That in itself is an important act. Having said that, that's not by itself an indication that critical scholarship is being done in these spaces. Now,
Hmm.
everybody doesn't have to do critical scholarship.
Right.
And but at the same time, you don't also have to conform to certain hegemonic institutional understandings of scholarship to do the work that you do. Critical scholarship can look different. Institutional forms of academia can also look different. So while there is a growing South Asian presence, but also a growing South Asian elite presence, this is not, you don't necessarily, the ranks of class have not been broken. So one has to be mindful of that. There are a few instances, and that is why I think the representation matters.
Hmm.
If somebody who's able to break the class barriers can bring themselves to such a place, in that case, the representation is of substantive value. But more and more elite people infesting these places in itself doesn't mean much. It means something, but it doesn't mean much. So people have to, for a variety of reasons, to survive in academia, to do well, to strategically do well, adapt different modes of scholarship. So my rather convoluted answer to this would be no. I don't think everybody who is from South Asia is necessarily doing the kind of work that questions these structures and these hegemonies. More often than not, there's actually a certain kind of conforming. This could be fully unintentional, and I'm very sympathetic to that, because you have to find your way around academia and survive.
Yeah.
But I do think there are people who have the potential and the capital to not conform. And it would be nice to see some of those people do more of this work rather than simply assume that because it comes from a branded institution, in itself, it means something. It means very little. If anything, brands bring with it a certain kind of conservatism that doesn't allow for academic creativity or a certain kind of academic rigor to flourish. So there's work to be done.
Indeed. We've talked about a lot of heavy stuff, and before we come to an end, to lighten the mood, because we talked a little about this in our previous conversation, and I asked you about certain book recommendations, and you told me that you turned the question on its head, and you told me that the importance of conversations and talking to various people is perhaps at par, if not more, than
Yeah.
reading. And I do acknowledge that, which is why I'm doing this podcast. I've learned so much during the course of speaking with people. So I'll change that question a little. What have you been reading lately? I can see Gautam Bhatia's The Wall in your background. In fact, I was
I
curious,
have been
what all is there?
I have been strong armed into buying that. If Bhatia is watching this, he will kill me. No, he's a dear friend, and I have been strong armed into buying that. But I do think when your friends are writing, it's important to read it. I haven't finished that yet.
It's a fascinating duology. I've read it. Gautam, in fact, was on the podcast also. The last episode was with him, and I absolutely loved it. So, to all the viewers, I strongly ask you to read The Wall and The Horizon. Fascinating stuff.
I look forward to reading it. I have not been able to make time, but that's definitely on my reading list. I'm actually reading 2, 3 different books at the moment. Of late, I find myself doing more science reading. So there's a book I'm reading about the history of the cosmos, the human interpretation of the cosmos. It might actually be somewhere here. Let me just quickly show it to you. Oops.
Oh,
So this
nice.
is something I'm reading right now. There's also this book called Entangled Life, which is an account of how closely we are related to the fungal form, and a few others. So my contemporary reading state is sort of, dipping into the sciences or dipping into some version of science and social science in conversation with each other, and then also just sitting and reading academic stuff at the same time. I don't know what that says about me on my reading, but and I also usually struggle to read more than 2, 3 books at the same time, but currently I find myself doing that, and the science reads, I'm enjoying them very much.
That's great. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing how you involve these readings in your writing, which I'm sure will happen either willfully or just subconsciously. So, ma'am, before we come to an end, this is a slightly open-ended question. Is there any sort of advice that you'd like to give to future academics or people who are trying to publish? Anything at all? A few wise words or wisdom from you before we wrap this up?
I have very little wisdom or advice to offer to anybody, honestly. I can share perspective at best. That's all I can do. And based on my own academic journey, and I've said this in your previous podcast as well, I think it's okay to feel like you're not conforming. You don't have to force yourself to it. There are times when choosing a conventional, rigorous approach can be helpful, by which I mean be flexible with your approach. You could be both doing that and be doing something else, and it's important to find out if you can. The second thing I would tell everybody is slow down. I think there is a lot of merit and pleasure in being able to slow down, and this is not just me saying this. There's actually a whole academic movement called the slow movement. There's a book called The Slow Professor that just sort of tells you to embody a form of academia which is completely in contravention to what the structures are demanding in terms of publish and just constantly make yourself visible and viable in different ways. I'd actually say go against this grain and slow down. It's for you, it's for your satisfaction. And the third thing is something I've already mentioned: document the affective life of your writing. It's a
Right.
very interesting experience. You learn so much about yourself, including, the errors between your perception and who you really are, or what is it that you're becoming at every stage in the life. None of us are constant in that sense. So those would be my, perspective sharing, not words of wisdom for anybody who's listening to this. And the only other thing I'd like to say is I fully recognize the challenges and limitations that students have in terms of publishing. And some of what I say may sound indulgent in that sense, but it is precisely for people who want to sustain the enjoyment and curiosity of reading and writing. And it may not be feasible for everybody to do that, but I'd still encourage thinking about it or doing it in small ways while trying to maybe strategically plan your career or anything else that institutions and structures around you demand from you. So, yeah.
Great. And I think with this, we can come to an end of today's conversation. Thank you so much, Rohini ma'am, for taking time out and speaking on so many different topics with me. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure this video will add a lot of value to all the viewers.
Thank you so much. Actually, on that note, before we go, I suggest you call me by my name. The ma'am is unnecessary.
All right.
So, yeah.
So if when I
I should have
call
said
you,
this in the beginning of the video, not towards the end, but it just occurred to me, I think, when he was speaking of Gautam and using his name, like, I don't see any reason why you should be calling me ma'am. So if we speak again, just my name is fine.
great. Thank you so much. With this, we'll wrap up.